Great Responsibility by Emrys the Merlin. Chapter 1. Good Morning, New York. The sun rose over the already busy streets of New York as a lone figure exited a tall building in the middle of the city. She was tall, with dark brown hair and big blue eyes. As she waved back towards the building, knowing several people were watching her leave, supposedly to meet up with a friend before school. Once she was out of sight of the building, she slipped into a deserted alley, and moments later, Spider-Girl was swinging through the skies of her city. She whooped as she practically flew through the sky. She loved it up here. There was only one real drawback.
That wall-crawling menace must be stopped. It is the duty of every New Yorker to report the activities of these miscreants. I will not rest until Spider-Girl is behind bars.
Spidey glared at the large screen across Times Square. And a good morning to you too, J. Jonah Loudmouth. Spider-Girl shot a line of webbing across the square, swinging across the city with ease. She started almost every morning like this, had started them like this for the past year. But that didn't mean she felt any better about being yelled at every morning by a 100-foot-tall image of a grumpy man who seemed to have nothing better to do than pick on her. But hey, she did the best she could with the time she had, spent most every morning and evening web-slinging and wall-crawling, saving the people of New York. She glanced around and swung over to a nearby apartment complex as a cop car skidded down the street. She shot a web line across the street, catching the car before it hit the front window of a bakery. The driver of the car, a middle-aged man in a police uniform, pulled himself out through the window and smiled up at Spider-Girl. I'm starting to think Jameson is wrong about you, Spidey. Piper grinned under her mask and saluted the officer. Spread the word, Chief. With that, she leapt down the wall and approached the armored truck. She knew who was behind this. The glue everywhere made that pretty obvious for anyone with working eyes. Come on out, Trapster. Fourth time's the charm, right? A tall, bald man came out of the back of the car, grinning. He was packing what looked like a very large hot glue gun, hooked up to a pack on his back. If it isn't my favorite spider-shaped punching bag. Let's see if you can do any better this time round. They had fought each other 3 times over the past year. Spidey was getting better with the training she was getting at home, but she had lost to him all 3 times. She would do better this time. He pulled his glue gun and fired a stream of the sticky substance at her. She flipped and dodged it by a millimeter and punched Trapster in the face, sending him flying into a nearby car. Piper's eyes widened as he pulled several glue grenades from God knew where and threw them. She dodged the first 2 with ease, but she didn't see the third one. It exploded, sending her, and lots of glue, flying into a wall. She pulled hard, but she was stuck fast, and the Trapster was readying his glue gun again. He pulled the trigger just as she shot a web and blocked the gun's barrel. Trapster clicked the trigger several more times, and Piper could see the glue backing up in the tube that led back to his pack. Spidey closed her eyes as the pack blew. She pulled herself off the wall and leapt down to the pile of glue that encased everything but the Trapster's eyes and nose. She grinned. This is what I'm supposed to leave that friendly neighborhood Spider-Girl note. Got a pen? She grinned. Trapster glared at her for a moment before his eyes widened in fear. Piper tensed, waiting for that tingly feeling she got when there was danger. She called it her spider sense. But it never came. She frowned. It didn't make sense. Villains didn't spook like that when there wasn't immediate danger in the area, to everyone, including the villain. A shadow passed over them, and Piper looked up. Oh, shield helicarrier's coming in really low. Spider-Girl. Piper jumped almost 3 feet in the air, spinning around to find Nick Fury, director of S.H.I.E.L.D., not 2 feet from her. Nick Fury, you make a habit of sneaking up on hard-working heroes? Fury narrowed his one eye at her. He gestured around at the mess that was the street covered in glue. Kid, we need to talk. Chapter 2, Ultimate. Listen, no one's saying you didn't stop the bad guy, but look around. Is this the way Captain America would have done it? Piper flinched at the alias of one of her favorite uncles. He'd been helping her train for combat scenarios ever since he had found her practicing in the Avenger Tower gym on the ceiling. But she wasn't anywhere near his caliber yet. He could have stopped the trapster in 5 seconds. You took 3 minutes with lots of collateral damage. Piper rolled her eyes behind her mask. Yeah, Cap could have stopped him sooner. He was Captain America, after all. She was not Captain America. I do a good job. She was a bit incensed by the critique. She got enough of that from Jameson's Bugletron billboards. Fury nodded. Yeah, for a clueless rookie. Hey, that's not at all true. Fury's eyes softened slightly as he laid a hand on her shoulder. Everyone starts out clueless, even Iron Man back when he was a novice. Piper almost laughed. She knew that all too well. She still had the video of her dad trying to fly for the first few times and failing miserably. It was hilarious. Fury almost looked like he knew what she was thinking. But he learned. Eventually. What would you say if I could turn eventually into right now for Spider-Girl? Piper laughed. I've already got people breathing down my neck about getting better at this. But you and Jameson should get together and talk. You seem to have a lot in common. She raised her arm to web swing away, and Fury stepped forward. I'm serious, Piper Parker. Her eyes bugged out under the mask, and she whirled. You know? He nodded. I know everything. Super spy, remember? He probably did know everything about her then. Her parents' mysterious deaths, her aunt and uncle. Her aunt lost a few years after that to a heart attack, then her Uncle Ben lost to a carjacker while looking for her when she'd run away after a fight. Tony Stark had ended up taking her in. She never knew the reason he was listed as her next guardian on her parents' will, but they had grown into a real family over the past 4 years. The Avengers had been her family for a little over a year now. When they had moved into Stark Tower, everything had gotten weird, but as if the universe had decided that her life wasn't weird enough, she had been bitten by a radioactive spider, and well, here she was, a year later, fighting crime on the streets of New York City. With great power comes great responsibility. Good words from a good man. Piper nodded. Those were some of the last words she had heard from her Uncle Ben. Even after all those years, they still stayed with her. They were part of the reason she did what she did, a big part of the reason she was Spider-Girl. Uncle Ben was the best. It's been, 4 years now? Piper nodded again. She refused to cry, though. She didn't want the lenses of her mask fogging up. Today would have been his birthday. She never forgot that day, and Tony knew it was important to her, so he made sure to put it up on every calendar and ordered a cake from her uncle's favorite bakery every year. You've honored him doing what you do. I'm offering you the chance to do better, to really learn about responsibility. Piper raised an eyebrow. It barely showed under the mask, but she wasn't convinced that Nick Fury didn't have every superpower in the book. She knew he would know. Meaning? He smiled slightly. I want to shield train you to be a better Spider-Girl. The ultimate Spider-Girl. Piper's eyes narrowed. How ultimate is ultimate? Fury smiled slightly as he pulled his gun from his holster. Trapster was making a break for it. Spidey eyed Fury as he pointed his gun straight up and fired once. The blast from the gun, which turned out to be some kind of laser pistol, hit a flagpole on one of the buildings. The pole bounced twice and struck Trapster in the back of the head. That ultimate. Spidey grinned. Sweet. You know, I think I've seen Auntie Tasha do something like that. Fury rolled his eyes at the childish nickname the teen had given to one of his top agents. A phone rang, and Piper looked down at her singular pocket sewn into the suit. By her, specifically, so she had a place to hold her phone. Oops. She said, pulling her phone out and ignoring a call from her best friend, Mary Jane Watson. I should probably set my ultimate cell phone to vibrate. Fury frowned slightly as she tucked her phone back in her pocket. Your tech could use a serious upgrade. He pulled something out of his coat. Here. Try this next generation web shooter. I had the boys in the lab whip it up. He slapped it on her wrist. She looked it over. It was about as long as her palm and stood up about 1.5 inches from its base. It matched her costume, but it was large and felt odd on her wrist as she flexed it. Too big, too clunky. Fury held out a hand. I didn't say no. Fury smiled slightly as she continued to examine the web shooter. With your talent and my training, you could learn to be a better hero. One of the greats. Spidey smiled, then thought of what her dad would say if he even suspected she was a hero, let alone talking about joining S.H.I.E.L.D. Thanks for the offer, but Dad says I shouldn't talk to strangers. Have a nice life! With that, she swung off towards school. She was going to be late again. Spidey didn't know it, but someone else had an eye on her. Two, in fact, though Dr. Otto Octavius and Norman Osborn didn't quite have her best interests at heart the way Fury claimed to. Chapter 3. Friends. By some miracle, Piper made it to school on time and even had a bit to spare as she stopped by her locker to drop off her backpack and grab the textbook she needed for her first period. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw her best friend in the world walk up to her locker. Mary Jane Watson was the sweetest and yet somehow scariest person Piper knew, and that was saying something considering she lived with two of the world's most deadly assassins and the Hulk. MJ had been there for her since the beginning, had helped her through her aunt's death, and offered to take her in when her uncle died. They had stayed fast friends through all of it, and she was the first person, and one of the only people, Piper had told when Tony had decided to officially adopt her. Piper, I have been calling all morning. Where have you been? Piper grinned sheepishly. Bus broke down. It was true that Piper had once taken public transportation to school. It was quite a way from Avengers Tower to Midtown, let alone Midtown High. Tony had let her pick what school she wanted to go to when he'd taken her in the hopes that it would help her retain some sense of normalcy. She chose to continue with the friends she'd already had. MJ rolled her eyes. Sure it did. Anyway, I wanted to show you this. She held up her phone and started playing one of Jameson's newscasts. One of his anti-Spider-Girl newscasts. Piper frowned as Jameson yelled about the ticking time bomb, Spider-Girl. Doesn't that jerk ever shut up? MJ smiled. Someday that jerk will give this journalism student her first job. Piper's eyes widened in surprise. What? You want to work for Jameson? Of course, MJ didn't know that by ragging on Spider-Girl, Jameson was also ragging on Piper. Piper hated lying to her oldest friend, but it was the only way to keep her safe. Jameson is the biggest game in town. We gotta be realistic. Not all of us have a millionaire for a dad. Not all of us can be Harry. Piper smiled at her friend, knowing that she didn't hold the fact that she had Tony Stark for a dad against her, mostly because it had never changed her. At that moment, Harry Osborn made his way down the hall, high-fiving someone from their math class. Piper couldn't remember his name off the top of her head. He was her other best friend. He'd been a friend when she'd really needed one. It had been 2 years ago when her dad had been kidnapped in Afghanistan. She had been on her way home to Stark Tower where she was staying alone while Pepper did paperwork back at Tony's Malibu mansion. Her rear tire had popped, and she had almost crashed into a tree. She had scraped up her hands pretty bad on the pavement and broken her glasses, which wasn't the biggest shame, because they were hideous, but she was practically blind without them. Lightning flashed as she tried to fix her bike and shivered in the rain. Then the limo had pulled up, and Harry had rolled down the window. Hey, Piper Parker. She had nodded. Yeah? He had grinned his million-watt smile. It's me, Harry Osborn, from school. Get in. He had hopped out of the limo to help her with her bike, and had even given her his jacket when she'd shivered in the rain. Thanks. He had smiled and opened the door for her before sliding back into the limo himself. Norman Osborn had sat across from her looking stoic. She really couldn't tell if he was angry or not. Piper had buckled her seatbelt as the limo drove off. Thanks, Harry, you didn't have to. His million-watt smile was back. Not a problem. He turned to his dad as Piper brushed her soaking shoulder-length hair out of her face and pulled it back, securing it with a rubber band she always wore for such occasions. Dad, this is that girl I was telling you about. The one who's always getting beaten up. Norman nodded at Piper. Sounds like you could use some friends, Piper. Piper nodded, holding her broken glasses in between her fingers. That would be really nice, sir. Harry had watched her out of the corner of his eye. And maybe you could be a friend to my Harry. Help him keep his mind on his studies. Harry had huffed, crossing his arms. I wish you would stop micromanaging my life. Give me reasons not to. Piper had glanced back and forth between the two. I just met you both, but I think it's great that your dad cares so much. Norman had raised an eyebrow at her. You sound like you speak from experience. Piper had nodded. I can't even really remember my dad. I was 3 when he died. I'm adopted, but Pepper busts my butt when I get out of line. She's kind of like my mom. Norman smiled. And Piper's none the worse for that, is she, Harry? Harry had stared at his dad, stunned, then grinned at Piper. He's smiling. My dad is actually smiling. How did you do that? Piper grinned and shrugged. It's a gift. They had been practically inseparable since then. After about a week after that fateful car ride, he had found out who her adoptive father was. She'd been scared that he wouldn't want to be her friend anymore, considering their fathers weren't on good terms at all. It seemed to make Harry even closer to her, though, being the only 2 high-profile rich kids in Midtown High, even though almost no one else knew that was what Piper was. He had helped her through Tony's kidnapping and celebrated with her and MJ when he had come home. Her day-to-day life was pretty good. She really couldn't complain about much if she was honest. Then her spidey sense went crazy and she flinched. Oh, puny Parker. Except for that. Piper turned and spotted Flash Thompson, crushing his fist into lockers. He had been bullying her since she was in preschool. He was the reigning football star, so no one stood up to him, even though he stuffed her in her locker at least once a week. She wondered what would happen if she turned the tables and took him down just once. The locker door slammed closed in her face. She sighed. But if I did that, I would be everything Jameson ever accused me of. Chapter 4. The Frightful Four. She was rescued a few minutes later by Stan the janitor and raced off to her first period class. A few hours later, she met up with Harry and MJ in the lunchroom. Harry glanced over at her, a bit of worry in his big blue eyes. Dude, locker knocker time again? Thompson is such a tool. Piper nodded as they sat down, Harry next to MJ and Piper across from the pair. She picked up her fork and loaded it with mashed potatoes. If that's the worst thing that happens to me today, I am definitely coming out ahead. The fork was halfway to her mouth when her spidey sense went crazy. It hadn't gone off like this since the house in Malibu had been under attack by the Mandarin last year. The fork dropped out of her fingers. As the wall behind her exploded, Piper leapt forward, pulling Harry and MJ with her, so they were out of the way of the table as it flipped over them. 3 figures walked in. 2 male, 1 female. Another floated in, quaking in fear. Piper recognized the figures at once. Thundra, a ruthless warrior woman from an alternative future timeline. Claw, a villain made out of living sound. And the Wizard, master of high-tech gadgets. The man floating helplessly in the air was the principal, Piper realized. It didn't make sense. Why were they here? Students, your principal has something to say. The poor man shook as he was floated in front of the students. Everyone, the school is now under the control of... Thundra finished his sentence for him. The Frightful Four. The room was silent for a moment before MJ, always the perfectionist, piped up. There's only 3 of you. The principal came flying across the room, slamming into the wall above the vending machines. That was right. Trapster was supposed to be a member of the Frightful Four, but Piper had already caught him. The wizard floated further into the room. Before the Trapster was captured, he learned that Spider-Girl attends this school. Unless she gives herself up, we will tear this place apart brick by brick. Piper heard some idiot in the crowd cheer. Wizard frowned. Very well then, Claw, give them a demonstration. Claw stepped forward and pointed his hand, the one that was actually a sonic blaster, at the roof above a large group of students. The blaster resounded and the roof trembled, sending pieces of masonry raining down on the students. Piper's fists curled. She couldn't do anything, not yet. Not without putting everyone she cared about in even more danger than they were now. Wizard floated in her direction. So, who is our mysterious wall crawler? Piper glanced around, thanking all her lucky stars that no one even glanced at her. A teacher, a student, a cafeteria lady. They seem reluctant to talk. Claw, make them listen to reason. The sound villain activated his noise cannon again, only this time it spread over most of the whole cafeteria. Piper clutched her ears, trying not to scream. She had a slight healing factor. She would be fine. It was everyone else she was worried about. Claw moved his blaster to another section of the room, and Piper couldn't take it anymore. Leave them alone! MJ grabbed her arm. Piper, no! Wizard smiled down at her. Definitely not, Spider-Girl. Thundra stepped forward menacingly. I'll crush the runt. MJ stepped back slightly as Wizard floated over to Piper. Wizard shook his head. No, don't crush her. Make an example of her. Claw, go ahead. Piper pushed MJ out of the way as sound slammed into her like a wall. She screamed and fell to her knees. Her ears rang and her head pounded. Partially because of her spidey sense, but mostly because of the noise that was currently splitting her skull. She felt blood trickle from her ear. Stop, I'll talk! She just needed the noise to stop. The sound stopped and Piper pulled herself up on one of the tables, right in front of a tray. Her brain was working on overdrive despite the ringing in her ears. Well, you have something to say, little girl. Piper caught her breath, wiping the blood off her face with her sleeve. Listen up, everyone needs to hear this. Piper paused for effect, then snatched the tray in front of her and took aim at Wizard. Food fight! She threw the tray hard. It smacked into Wizard, sending him spinning. Everyone cheered and grabbed the nearest article of food before throwing it at a member of the Frightful Four. Piper rolled under the table and headed for the nearest pillar before crawling up it. She popped open one of the ceiling tiles and crawled inside. How the hell did they find out? She pulled off her blue button-up and her white tank top. She glanced down at her costume and saw something sticking to her armpit. She yanked and nearly tore the costume. It was small, black and green. It was a tracer. Fury was right. I have a lot to learn about responsibility, she whispered as she crushed the tracer between her fingers.